Hey folks, welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. I'm Corey, your host. This episode, I don't have a long preamble. I just kind of have my first interview is with Callie Wright, who is a podcaster and activist and speaker at various conferences. And they are a great person who has been around in the podcasting scene for a long time. I've known them for a long time, and I think it's really great to have them on to hear about their change in political views over the years, and just to know more about them, spread the word. And then, of course, in the second half of the show, we have a book review with Justin Clark. The book we cover is The Question of Palestine by Edward Saeed. It sounds like an amazing book. It's a really good review by Justin. So yeah, I don't have much of a preamble. Both of these segments are kind of longer than I think that I've normally been putting in. It's not that there's not much to say. There's always stuff to say, but sometimes I don't know how to say it. Like, I've been thinking about the idea of sin a lot lately, because as an atheist, obviously, I think that it's a silly concept. There's no such thing as this ultimate bad, like this thing that we've sinned against. There's no God to be affected by such a thing. I disagree with the fundamental idea that humanity is broken and because of some original sin, or that sin can carry from one to another. That's not to say that there's no responsibility when we acknowledge our societal problems that come from the past misdeeds of our forefathers or foremothers or our past relatives. I think that there is a responsibility to do the right thing. We have some responsibility to bear based on the current system because we still benefit from systems of oppression. Many of us are still in very privileged positions over others, and it shouldn't be that way. And there's entire cultures that have had their children stolen, and like this situation in Kamloops where they found 215 bodies underneath from a residential school. That's obviously it's not even like that long ago. It's not something that's new, and it's not something that's entirely stopped. Like, the foster care system here still takes away a lot of children from people under, various rules. Like, I'm not saying that social workers are intentionally taking away Indigenous children, but there's a lot of rules that are in place that stop Indigenous children from being placed with relatives or with, various other people. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on that could be considered a continued genocide and continued oppression, for sure, in regards to that. And I think, a lot of these ideas about what sin are, they ignore stuff like that, while then also, villainizing, LGBTQIA people. The gender and sexually diverse community has long been a target of this idea of sin. And it just seems absolutely ridiculous, right? That the actual harming of individuals because they're not white is not seen as a sin, but people consensually behaving in sex or sexual acts with each other is considered a sin. It's just, it's a bizarre reasoning. Obviously as an atheist, I don't think that it's possible for me to understand this because I don't believe in this being that supposedly made these rules. So it's hard for me to even grasp, how anybody can even reach that level. How do you convince yourself that not only does a supreme being who runs the entire universe care about these little, these people in their day-to-day lives doing things that don't hurt anybody and don't affect anybody except themselves. And yet, these people in his name or her name or its name, whatever, their name, these other people who wear religious garb and are from the Catholic Church, who are doing who are hurting children and discarding their bodies without burial, without even informing the parents in many cases, how can you say that that's, not a sin? But maybe it is. Maybe some people would say that's a sin. And I mean, I think if there's such a thing as sin, it's the sin of harming others is the only one, right? Like that's everything that you do that hurts another person that would fit under that. Like I can't see anything else that would fit that term. Maybe I'm completely off base here, but anyway, I was not going to ramble on for very long. I've just been thinking about the idea of sin for a while, and it's a bizarre concept to me, and I hate it. I hate it. People existing isn't a sin. People loving each other isn't a sin. There was a time when people who were of different races being together would have been considered a sin. And fuck that. Like, all of this stuff, it's just arbitrary. It's all just the people who are bigoted using their religion as a cudgel to beat their own bigotry into society. Like they just say, well, I don't like gay people, therefore it's a sin. Well, even if I care what your God thinks, why should I agree with you on what is a sin? Why should I care what your religious belief says at all? We should live in a society where, like, that's the whole point of like the multicultural society, is that we all get to have an input, and your opinion can be respected up to the point where it's not harming somebody who has a different opinion or a different belief. You don't get to dictate to other people how they live. So too bad. But anyway, enough is enough. That wasn't a very articulate rant anyway. I hope that you enjoy this interview with Callie, who is a much more eloquent person than I am. And then I hope you enjoy the book review. I will see you in the half. I guess I didn't mention this now. I don't know if there will be any bonus content from this episode. There might be a very small amount, maybe 5 minutes from the Callie interview and maybe 20 minutes from the book review, actually. Me and Justin talked for quite a while after we stopped recording, and my backup was recording. So, I'm going to process that and put that out for patrons after. Yeah, there's going to be a little bonus content from that, but not a lot from the Callie interview. But I hope you enjoy both anyway. Thanks. Hi, and welcome to The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, the podcast where I promote progressive politics, left-wing philosophy, and critical thinking by talking to a variety of people and getting their ideas out there. Today I'm talking to Callie Wright from the podcast Queersplaining. Is that, I guess, the best way to explain it now?
That's the one.
Formerly the Gaytheist Manifesto, which is when I started listening. Yep. That's a long time ago now.
Yeah, God. I was actually just thinking about that the other day. I think it's been like 7 years now since I started podcasting. I'm old. It's fine.
That's awesome. It's a great hobby, actually. And and I suppose
thankfully for me, it's it's part of how I pay the bills now with between my podcast and doing freelance work for other clients. So yeah,
that's amazing. So my show is a political show. And I wanted to talk to you kind of a bit about where you are now versus where you used to be. But first, I guess a good place is a little bit of your background for anybody who doesn't already know you.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a queer trans podcaster. Like we just said, I've been podcasting for 6 or 7 years now. And originally it was, very specifically, like I wanted to talk about LGBTQ stuff and atheist stuff, like all together, because I had some incidents, particularly when I started getting into the queer community where I live. I felt very unwelcome there as a person who wasn't religious. Which I was like really surprised and really bummed about. It was like being like actively proselytized to. And, I heard a whole lot of the things you hear about how you can only be a good person if you believe in God, or like that's the only place that you can find like comfort and solace and all of that. And and I was, when I got into the whole thing, I noticed like, lots of these events happen at churches, right? And the practical reason for that is because a lot of times churches will let you use their facilities for free, right? So like I try to be sympathetic to that. But I figured like, well, okay, this is the queer community, right? Like even people who are religious are at least going to be like compassionate towards those of us who are not, especially those of us who are not for like very deeply personal reasons, right? And I was really bummed to find that wasn't necessarily the case.
No kidding.
And then in the atheist world, even like when I first started getting involved and was still really unaware of, the domination of like, straight white cis dudes and the covering up of shitty behavior and all, like even before I was aware of any of that, just on a surface level, I was like, where are all the trans people? Like, I know they exist. Like, why don't they have podcasts or YouTube channels or like run nonprofits or whatever?
Yeah, for sure.
And so like the TLDR version is like those thoughts rolled around a whole bunch. And I was like, okay, so I want to do some kind of activism at this intersection of communities. And, at the time I was listening to a ton of podcasts and I have an audio engineering background. Like I went to school to learn how to run recording studios. And so I had all of the gear and all of the know-how. And so it's like, it just seemed logical. Like, I guess I'll just start a podcast. And that's,
for sure.
There's a ton of other details in there, but we'd be here for like an hour if I told you the whole story.
Yeah.
But that was basically it. And I just thought like, wow, there's like a whole lot of stories that aren't being told and a lot of perspectives that aren't being heard. And like if I'm having this problem, I'm sure I'm not the only one. And so that's kind of where my entree into like podcasting and activism and community building and that sort of stuff came from. And then, over time, I have grown more interested in the idea and the power of storytelling specifically, as opposed to just like, it started as very much a traditional interview style podcast, much like I'm sure we're going to do here, which is great. Like that's not like, I always try to take pains to say like, I'm not shitting on that medium or that style. There are lots of great shows that I listen to and enjoy. But I just became more interested in the idea of like, I want to hear your story. I want to get to know like you and where you came from and how you got to be where you are and like what we can all learn from that kind of thing. And so over time, my podcasting kind of shifted more in that, as opposed to just doing a straight up interview. It's more like public radio storytelling, type stuff. And then, aside from that, I am a giant Star Trek nerd. Sort of an intermediate Klingon speaker. When it's not pandemic times, I play roller derby and I like coffee and dogs a whole lot. So that's like the TLDR Callie in a nutshell.
That's perfect. I guess, thinking about your show, the way you do it with the storytelling, like that's so like as a talking shop perspective, it's so much editing and in-depth. Like that's why I don't do that type of show because it's so intensive.
Well, and honestly, I'm very fortunate, because I am able to do the show that way specifically because I have enough support on Patreon that I can treat it like part of my job.
Right.
I block out a day, sometimes 2 days of like full work day to put the show together. Cause like, sometimes I do monologue episodes and those are usually half to 3/4 of a day worth of writing and then maybe another half a day to full day of like recording and editing and mixing and stuff.
Right.
But the shows where I do an interview with someone else and I'm cutting it into a story, sometimes I can spend 30 or 40 hours just in the edit. For an hour to an hour and a half long interview. And it's a ton of work, but it's really creatively fulfilling. Like that's the kind of stuff that I sort of most enjoy listening to, like as a listener. Right. And it's also just really creatively fulfilling to put together and, just like pulling in all of the best parts of someone's story and really, cause most of the people that I talk to are not people who are on podcasts a lot, right? There's no media training, there's no experience, right? And so people are usually like really nervous and they like start sentences over and there's lots of flubs and that kind of stuff. And it's also like really personally fulfilling to me to be able to like take that person's story, put it into a way that's easy for other people to understand and hand it back to that person. Because that's the other person saying like, oh man, like I don't think I've ever been able to tell my story that well to another person. And that's really cool for me. It's sort of a way for me to help out like the person that I'm interviewing and the folks who listen, because I feel like everyone kind of gets something out of it. And that's, there's a political aspect to that, right? Because a lot of what you hear about in the like audio making world and podcasting is extractive storytelling, right? So like, you go, you parachute into a place, you fly in on a plane, you talk to this person, you have zero idea of the cultural context they come from.
Yeah.
You're a cis person interviewing a trans person, a white person interviewing a black person, that kind of stuff. You have no idea where this person comes from, where their background is. And all you're thinking is, how do I get the story out of this person and put it in a way that's going to get the most clicks, the most, ad revenue, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And, that one of the reasons I stopped being a fan of capitalism, which I'm sure we'll get into, is, obviously that's the drive, right? You want clicks and you want listens. But like what I'm interested in is like what someone's actual story is. And, the mainstream, I hate using this phrase, the mainstream media. Like what other phrase is there, right?
Yeah.
But like, like the major news outlets, they do such a bad job telling trans stories. And it's because, one, they're usually only, if it's focused on a trans person, they only talk to that one trans person. The reporter is a cis person with zero cultural competence. And the editors are thinking about the audience, which is not trans people.
Right.
And you put all of those things together and you get stories that focus only on the hardship, and they focus only on like, this person's life was miserable and they wanted to die, and then they had surgery and now life is great. And that's like the only trans narrative we ever hear.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's definitely a, like, sometimes we laugh so we don't cry kind of thing, but that also like legitimately does a really bad disservice to the public discourse and the way that the broader society views trans people. And so that's what I try to do is to kind of solve that problem. Like a trans person, obviously, like I'm white, I'm middle class, so I don't have a perfect understanding of everyone's perspectives, but I do understand what the extractive storytelling model looks like. And I'm actively working to subvert that model as the right way to tell people's stories. And it's because like, I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of that. And so it's really important to me that I don't do that for other people. And I think that's why people, trans folks especially, why they glom onto the show, because I don't do that kind of storytelling.
Yeah. Like, that's one of those things where they talk about representation in media, right? Like that's why it's important for Indigenous peoples to cover Indigenous cultural stories, or so that they're not just, a white dude going into a reserve and being like, hey, look at all these people suffering from alcoholism. Must be a thing with natives,
Well, and even... as a person not part of a community, to make a serious commitment to understanding that community even.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because like in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it is impossible for a cis person to tell a good trans story, right? It's just that the way media generally works is not conducive to that. Because like, I've heard it done. I listened to, there's a show called The Cut, where they did an interview with Tori Peters, the author of the book Detransition Baby. And the host of that is a cis person, but she still did a fantastic interview. And I could tell she really knew what she was talking about, right? The problem, obviously, being a trans person doing trans stories, that's going to get you there, right? But what frustrates me is that I don't actually think it would be that difficult for cis people to tell good trans stories if they really, really decided they wanted to. Like, because all you got to do is just like do the reading, do the work, get to know people, talk to people. It's like, it's not even really that hard. And I think that's part of the reason it's part of what's so frustrating for me. It's like, we're not this like complicated lockbox that you can't get into, right? Like so many of us are just sitting here waiting for people to be like, hey, can I talk to you about a thing? And so many people are just like not interested in doing that. It's very frustrating.
It's interesting actually, because there always seems to be the motivation for them to like embed themselves with QAnon or white nationalists. You'll see these in-depth like docuseries about these people that, okay, so you got to know them and you figured out their backstory and you did all the research. And why can't you do that with marginalized groups?
Right. And that's a fantastic question. And I think, I don't know, that's a very, very multifaceted answer to that question. And I'm not an expert in journalism. I didn't go to school or anything, but like I have a lot of journalist friends. I have a lot of trans journalist friends, and they've spent a lot of time educating me on these problems. And yeah, I mean, that's, how many articles did we see about like, oh, like we've still got to work to understand why someone voted for Trump, even though they all say the same like 5 things. You know what I mean?
We actually know why.
Yeah, like this is not some burning question that we don't have the answer to. And it's the same thing with QAnon. Like they're out there telling you exactly, like, they're wrong and evil and terrible, but what they are not doing is hiding their motivations.
Yeah,
right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's strange media these days. Like you say, I hate using the term mainstream media because it's so destroyed by, I guess, Trump and the right. But yeah, also, what else are they? Like that's literally
right.
What
I mean, that is that is exactly what it is. Yeah, it's honestly gotten to the point where most major news outlets, when they do a trans thing, I just don't read it or pay attention to it anymore. Like I just saw, this is Caitlyn Jenner running for governor of California, which is just, I mean, first of all, doomed to fail, right? Like there's no way she's actually going to have any success in that. But like immediately people are like, prominent transgender activist Caitlyn Jenner. No, she's not. She's a lot of things. She is not a transgender activist. Like you don't even have to dislike her to say that. Like that's just not a thing she is.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's because
she's a
in
Republican.
society, well, and it comes back to the idea that like if you are an out trans person of any prominence, you're automatically seen as an activist. Which like. Even if I loved Caitlyn Jenner, I wouldn't call her an activist. That's just not a thing she does.
No, that's right.
And again, it's really easy to not fuck that up.
It's pretty basic. Even that one's really basic.
Yeah.
Okay. Kind of to shift gears a little bit. Like I say, I kind of wanted to talk to you about your change in political views. So what do you identify as politically now?
I would say I'm a leftist, and I don't know that I have a deep enough understanding of theory to apply a more specific label than that. And that's okay. I don't necessarily feel like I need to. And this is actually, I think my gender journey has informed a lot of this in saying that like, I can tell you with like 100% certainty a whole lot of things I'm not. I'm not 100% sure I can tell you exactly what I am, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fair.
So when I first became politically aware, I think my politics as a like tween, teenager, late teens, early 20s, I really think my politics were just contrarian more than anything. It was just that idea that like, well, if it's mainstream, it's probably wrong. And I'm cool enough that I figured that out. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I was definitely, I used to be, oh God, this is embarrassing. I used to be like a Family Guy edgelord kind of person. I was one of those, like, I'm not racist, but I'm not sexist, but kind of people. Not proud of having been that way, but that's where I was. And as time went on, I think I started to become more of probably like a mainstream liberal, in that like I recognize like, okay, yeah, like systemic racism is a thing, sexism is a thing. I don't like any of that. Like everybody should be treated equally. That's cool. Of the people I hear speaking politically, Democrats seem to be mostly on that side. So I think maybe that's where I'm at. And that was like early to mid 20s. I kind of went into that mode, and I lived there until I figured out I was trans. And this is part of the reason that I try to give people a little grace when they're coming from a fucked up place politically, is that, like, given my background, given the environment that I grew up in, I'm not 100% sure that I would have come to the place politically where I am if I wasn't trans. because I started to learn about trans issues and the systemic issues therein. And so I would have those arguments and those conversations with people, and then I would start to see the parallels with other axes of oppression, right? And so, like, obviously transphobia and racism, for example, not the same thing. But the way people on the wrong sides of those issues argue has a lot of similarity in it. Like, there are similar themes, right? And so I would see that and think like, oh, wait a minute, that actually sounds familiar to me. And so what I did is I joined a bunch of leftist Facebook groups, like sort of like specifically like feminist, leftist, atheist type Facebook groups. And I didn't interact much. I just kind of like looked at the discourse and saw what people were saying, and blog articles people would link to and that kind of stuff. And that started to push me further and further left. And I think I was sort of until probably 2 or 3 years ago, I would have called myself maybe like a leftist pragmatist. Like in an ideal world, here's what I would want, but we have to deal with reality, so here's what we can get, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, probably within the last year and a half to 2 years, I would say I've gone pretty hardcore left in terms of like, I'm a police and prison abolitionist. I'm like 100% in favor of like seizing and redistributing wealth and, and those sorts of things. And so like, what I know of communism appeals to me. I'm not sure that I know enough about the theory to say like 100% like I'm on board with that label. And I mean, also like communism is also a million different things, right? There's like a ton of subheadings under communism and different ways that, cause communism is the ideal and the disagreement usually is how we get there. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not super familiar with all of the varying theories and how that works. I would still call myself a pragmatist in that, I think it's worth fighting for ideas that seem impossible, because like all of the progress that we take for granted now seemed impossible at one point or another, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But what I can't forget is that like there are people out on the streets there right now suffering, and if I can take action that helps that even a little bit, I should still probably do that, even if it's not #TheRevolution, right?
Yeah.
And that's where lots of leftist discourse leaves me behind a little bit, because I get the sense among a lot of leftist groups that they don't feel like activism is worth doing if it's not directly contributing to the #revolution, right?
Yeah.
And I can't get on board with that, right? And that's not to say that I don't think it's a good idea, and it's not something that like I would be happy to contribute to and help be a part of. But like I said, I live very much in the today. Like, what about today? What about tomorrow? Where are these people's meals going to come from tomorrow? Like, where is the roof over their head going to be tomorrow? And if we can apply pressure anywhere to make that position better in the here and now for today and for tomorrow, we should probably be doing that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, whatever label that is, that's what I am.
Sure. I'm not sure what exactly you want to pin that down as. That's perfect. I just saw something the other day, or maybe it was even earlier today, where like there was a homeless encampment, and rather than rush these people out of their encampment, the community built tiny little houses for them. Mm-hmm. I mean, it didn't solve the overall issues, but it gave them a roof over their head that's permanent, that they can call an address, that solves a small problem and doesn't technically contribute to the #revolution, right?
Right. Well, and that's, and there's probably some debate to be had there, right? Because like there's, the idea of like building parallel power, reducing your dependence on the state so the state eventually crumbles. So the idea being that you don't need some violent revolution, you just build enough parallel power that the state becomes unnecessary and crumbles on its own. And so that's like the revolution that is not like people with AK-47s on the street gunning down the bourgeoisie, right?
Yeah, it's
and like
mutual aid networks. And
yeah, exactly. And I love that kind of stuff. And that's why, like, that's why like I give money to like mutual aid food groups all the time, because I think that's like direct activism that's going to make people's lives better in the here and now today. And like, I'm not rich, but I'm comfortable and I've got a little bit of extra to throw around here and there. And that's usually what I end up doing, is I just like find a mutual aid group that says they're struggling and just like send them $50 or whatever. Yeah,
that's awesome. It's stuff like that, like that the comments underneath that article that I was looking at, there's a number of leftists who are going, well, this isn't enough. This isn't enough. This isn't enough. And I agree wholeheartedly. Right. But I also want to be able to acknowledge that this is a good thing, that we're, as a community, that they got together and gave people tiny houses. Tiny's not great, location might not be great, but I don't know. It seems weird to call this not enough all the time and without ever saying like, yeah, this is also a positive thing.
Yeah. And that's the struggle for me, right? Because we know that part of the reason progressive reforms happen is to keep the pressure just far enough away that the system maintains itself, right?
Yeah.
And that's when, and I am not an accelerationist, but in moments like that, I at least kind of understand where they're coming from. You know what I mean? Like that's never going to be a thing that I advocate, because that will entail horrific suffering and death. But like conceptually, I get it, right? Like the idea is that if you keep things from becoming bad enough, then we get to maintain the status quo. People keep suffering, and we still call that progress when it's really not. And like, I can't disagree with any of that, right? Like that is all correct. But I would feel very comfortable saying that almost every person who benefited from that would say like, yes, this is a good thing. I'm very glad this happened. Yeah. And like that person's life is now better for that. And I can't write that off. That's just not a thing that I'm ever going to be able to bring myself to do. I don't, that doesn't fit in with my politics.
Yeah. It's similar, I find, to like, there's multiple very good arguments against like a universal basic income. But one of those arguments is that it just placates people while the rich get richer, and we don't expropriate the means of production.
Right. Well, and also because so many models of UBI are about like very basic subsistence and survival, right?
Yeah.
It's not something that really allows people to go out and live a life. It is enough to allow people to survive. And those are two different concepts. And again, survival is a whole lot better than what a lot of people are doing right now. And so again, that's where I come back to that argument. And it's just that, it's a really hard one for me.
So you have had, I guess you've had like one main episode on your show about socialism. Are you going to be exploring that a bit more?
Yeah, I don't know about on the show, just because that's like political education is not something that I focus so much on the show. Not that I don't think it's important. I just don't think that's what I do. I did that one episode because I thought it was an important thing for people to get primed on. Because it does, I mean, obviously like the well-being of all marginalized people is something that is informed by those sorts of politics, right? And so on a personal level, it's definitely something I'm exploring more. But like on the show, unless that is part of some larger story, I'm not sure that there will be much, if anything, more on the show about it so much.
That's understandable.
Aside from like I would love to do like an on the ground profile of an activist and like what they do and what their life is about. You know what I mean? But the profile would be more about like why this person does what they do, who they are, what they're about, than a specific, like, this is their political philosophy and this is, you know what I mean?
Right. Not an exploration of the direct philosophy, but more of the story, like you say.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I've honestly, I've thought about doing a separate thing like that, because that's honestly how I learn the best. Because like reading political theory turns my brain to mush, honestly. Yeah. Like I've got tons of books on my iPad and on my bookshelf about political theory. And I'm not that good at following it. But if I talk to somebody who really knows their shit, then it's really easier for me, especially because, if I read something in a theory book and it doesn't make sense to me, then I have to like run to the computer and Google and read a bunch of different perspectives. But like, if I have a person sitting in front of me who I know really knows their shit, I can ask questions and I can ask for clarification and that kind of stuff.
Right.
And especially my buddy Will, the Star Trek communist, he's great. And I've thought about like, hey, Will, do you want to do like a weekly webcast? Because like
that'd be awesome.
Well, yeah. And my problem is like on a grand scale, I don't have a ton of extra time in my life.
Right.
So like I wouldn't really be able to do preparing. So I would literally just be like, okay, we're going to get that together at like 6 p.m. every Thursday and just like go on YouTube Live and just talk about it for a minute. Like that's what it would have to be. And I don't know that I would feel good about that because I like when I'm going to do something like that, I feel the need to prepare and like think about questions and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
The time probably isn't there.
Yeah, that's what I just, even during pandemic times. And I feel like, I don't know. I feel like a lot of us know what it's like to actually end up working more during the pandemic than before. Yeah. And that's 100% my, and like, that's not meant as like a humble bragger to be dismissive, because I know a lot of people have the opposite problem and it's a very serious one. But yeah, I've actually been more busy in the last year or so than I was before.
Yeah. Like I went from working in the oil field then to doing gig work, and I had to work just to make even a little bit close to what I was making in the oil field. Like the gig work hours you got to put in, you basically don't have any extra time. You said for counter propaganda, you wanted to cover the issue of trans people in sports. Because this is something that is apparently everywhere right now.
Yeah. And that's almost literally true. Like so many states have stuff either in progress or passed or like in committee. I forget the number. I want to say it was like 44 states or something wild like that. Have a bill in some stage, whether it's like in committee or like coming up for a vote or on the governor's desk or whatever. There's we could probably take up another 2 or 3 hours with this topic alone. But like, I come at this from two different angles. The first being, it's just so obviously creating a problem so you can propose the solution using a group of marginalized people that the public knowledge is very small about, right? So even now at this point, I would say most people's awareness of trans stuff is the awareness that trans people exist. And that's like as far as the knowledge goes, right? And so there's just so much blank space to be filled up with information in the public consciousness about trans stuff. And as the right is wont to do, they recognize that as a chance to fearmonger and gain support by saying like, yes, these people are the enemy, these people are dangerous, and we have your solution. And that's to stop kids from getting health care, keep trans people out of sports, keep trans people out of the bathrooms, all of that sort of stuff.
Right.
And so like, to summarize, that's like the first problem is that like, this is simply not actually a problem for anyone except conceptually.
Right.
It is just factually and ethically incorrect. Completely emotionally removing myself from the context of the situation. But the second side of this is that I can't completely remove myself of the emotional context of the situation, not only because I'm trans, but also because I'm an athlete. I play roller derby. And, I respect anyone's level of love or involvement for sports, whether it's their entire life or they couldn't care less. I never considered myself a person that was very into sports at all, except when I was in like middle school and early high school. And sports didn't really appeal to me. A lot of like football fans, soccer fans, basketball fans, whatever. It's what you're into. I love and respect it. I don't care about it. And I got into roller derby. Long story short, it was like I like exercising, but I don't like exercise. And so like, if I want to keep doing that, I should probably find a sport. And, you know, the only sport that I had a hope of being welcome in was roller derby. And so I checked it out, and, like, turns out being an athlete, athleticism and team sports in the way that it works, at least in my experience, is something that has been like deeply, deeply meaningful and formative to me as a human being. And legitimately, my friend group is roller derby. I've learned a lot of self-confidence because of roller derby. You know, and that like I put on skates and hit people, right? And I really suck at this, but I'm going to try this new thing anyways. And oh my God, I figured it out. Like there's so much confidence and self-love and that can come from that. And it's turned out to mean a lot more to me than I ever thought it would. I imagined that it was like, yeah, I'll make some friends, I'll have some fun, I'll stay strong and stay in shape, and it'll be a cool hobby. And it took like no time at all for it to become one of the most important things in my life. And I think for people who want them, team sports are not just a fun thing that you do like on the weekends or whatever. It's something that is deeply important and deeply meaningful. And you learn so much about yourself and how to interact with the world. And the idea that there's such this Herculean effort to deny that, not just to adults, but to kids, right? Like, I mean, I'm an adult, a middle-class adult. So like generally I can go like have a drink at a bar instead of playing sports, and I can make friends that way, you know? But there are lots of people for whom like team sports are going to be the only way that's accessible for them. Like if you go to public school and you don't have to pay a lot of money to play the sport, like that's something that your life can really seriously suffer from being denied if it's a thing that you want. And the idea that they want to keep people out and expel people currently involved, I just think about what my life would be like if I knew I didn't have that anymore. And I mean, the pandemic has taught me that a little bit, right? Because the entire world stops. Obviously, putting on skates and hitting people isn't going to be something that you do during a pandemic. And I know how much it's gutted me to have that taken from me, even on a temporary basis, right? Like, barring something absolutely wild, I will put on skates and hit my friends again. And so like I have that knowledge. But I know how much it gutted me to have that taken away from me and not to be able to do that, and not to be able to see my friends, and not to be able to learn those like really important life lessons and have those amazing experiences that sports can provide. And it is absolutely, utterly heartbreaking to me to know that like there are people who are like at risk of having that denied to them, and I mean, some of these laws have actually been passed into law. And of course, I mean, you know, the ACLU will do their thing, but like, you know, good thing we've got the Supreme Court, right? Womp womp. And so, yeah, so I'm coming at it from an angle of like, it's just like factually wrong and silly. And also that it's like deeply personal to me, and that I am a trans athlete, and the idea of that being denied just kills me. And so I guess the counter propaganda to that is to just like look at the information and listen to doctors. Like if you look at the hearings that people have been going through, so many of these politicians were asked like, okay, so like how many transgender athletes are there in your state? Well, I'm not actually like fully aware of. Okay, so like how many of these problems have been reported? Well, I'm not actually, like, it's not a thing. It's not a problem. And if you look at the science, everybody says they follow the science, and lots of people don't follow the science. But all, you know, and all that's to say as well, like, what's really important to know about this is that like, they're choosing to go after us in this time because we're an easy target at the moment, and we're more vulnerable. But, you know, it's, you know, at first it was like, well, it's just about like keeping kids away from health concerns, which is bullshit. But they said that's all it was about. And now all of a sudden it's sports too. And then there's a bill, I forget what state it's in, that will make it illegal for insurance to cover trans stuff, even if an insurance company wants to cover trans stuff. And there was a state considering a law where they would have to put warning signs on the bathrooms to say that trans people are allowed to use these bathrooms. And then, the idea is it is not going to stop wherever they say, like, well, it's just about this. It's not going to stop there, right? Like, they're absolutely going to come after marriage rights again. They're setting the stage for that.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you're a queer who thinks the fight ended with marriage equality, which we don't actually have marriage equality, that's a whole other thing. Lots of disabled people can't get married because of SSI benefits. Look it up. But like, they're going to come after marriage rights. They're going to keep chipping away, just like they have with abortion. So yeah, that's my very long rant.
I guess my thoughts on the trans sports issue and the transgender kind of limitations that they're trying to impose. It just seems a continuation of, like you say, a problem that doesn't actually exist. Like, the first time I ever heard of a trans person in sports was on the Joe Rogan show, which is not a good place.
Yeah. Nothing good happens at that place.
But he actually, he actually had somebody push back against what he was saying. Like, he had a trans person on whose name I cannot recall. And every time he would be like, yeah, but men are this way and women are this way. And they would be like, no, no, that's not right.
Well, I actually have a really funny story about that if we have time to share.
Sure.
So I'm not going to name names of anyone involved because I genuinely believe this person was asking because he didn't know. And so I don't want to like dime him out and like put him out there like I'm trying to make fun of him or tear him down or anything like that. So not naming names. And I won't even say where or when this happened. But at a convention, I was approached by someone. This was a convention in which I had a forward-facing role. I was a person on stage. And this person, seeing me in that role, said like, hey, do you know where this other speaker is? I wanted to ask them a question. And this was someone who had given a talk about trans stuff. And I happened to know who he was asking about. And I was like, no, actually, you know what? Like their plane left this morning. They had to go home, family stuff, something like that. I was like, but if you wanted to ask about trans stuff, I'm trans and like, you can ask me your questions if you want. But like, if you want to ask them specifically a question, like no sweat on that either. And so he went ahead to ask me the question, and he was asking about, trans people in sports. And he did that sort of like, well, like men are like this and men are like this and men are like this. And pointing out the very obvious, like, bigger bone structure, bigger hands, a thicker skull, whatever, that kind of stuff that they say.
Right. The things they say. Yeah.
And then he turns around and he points to this person and says like, okay, but this person over here, he's pointing to this person as the sort of prototypical woman form or shape or size, and was pointing out all of the ways that, like, by his perception, this person is just like naturally at a disadvantage to someone like him. And what he apparently didn't know about this person is that this person was a trans woman that he was pointing to. And
so that could have been a very educational moment.
And again, I'm not going to name any names at all because I tell this story not to shame this person, but to legitimately say, like, we need to rethink what we think. But I say that to say that the person who was asking the question should have known this person was a trans woman, because they're a trans woman in a rather prominent position, where I was like, is he really pointing to, like, she's a trans woman and he doesn't know that, like, very publicly a trans woman. And so, and I said what I've repeated here my whole time. I was like, well, let me blow your mind for a second. I'm not giving away any secrets here, but like, this person here, like, she is a trans woman. And he seemed legitimately taken aback. And I was trying really hard. Like, I'm not trying to beat you up or like do a gotcha moment kind of thing. But like, I really hope that this has been an eye opener in terms of re-examining your assumptions about people. and he really seemed thoughtful. He seemed to really take it in. And then I had occasion to excuse myself from the conversation. Yeah. A good friend of mine had walked by a few minutes before and was like, "Hey, Callie, when you get a second," and he like pointed that direction, like, "Hey, I'm going to be at my table. Come talk to me for a second." And I was like, "Yeah, cool." And I took that opportunity to be like, "Oh yeah, like I'm going to go see what he wanted. I got to be on stage in a couple of minutes." So I had gotten that out. But he really seemed to, that seemed to be an eye-opening moment for him. And so yes, it is high time for many, many people to rethink their assumptions and biases on the topic.
Yeah. I don't know. It's one of those things, like I have always, ever since I got into bodybuilding, actually, like back in my early 30s, I would always hear the typical standard guy thing. "Oh, that I don't think she's good looking. She looks too much like a man," type of nonsense. And I always disagreed with it. I was like, this is a person who put in all this work to build these muscles and do this, like, even when I was like, I wasn't what they might call a woke person, but it just didn't make any sense to me that, you're limiting men and women in these various ways. And I mean, now, obviously, I don't even think that gender should be part of the discussion around sports, really.
Well, I think there are reasons for it to be a discussion, but what I will say is it's a bit lengthy, and there's no way I'd be able to recite it from memory. But the WFTDA, the Women's Flat Track Derby Association, they're the governing body for the roller derby group of leagues that I play in. They call it a gender statement that is sort of about the WFTDA's philosophy about gender inclusion. And I don't know that it's perfect, and I don't think anything ever would be, but it's about as close as I could possibly imagine to a position statement on gender in sports. And so, like, if you just literally Google the phrase WFTDA gender statement, and it'll come up. It'll be the first thing. Okay.
Yeah, no, I will even do that for everybody and put it in the show notes.
There you go. Yeah, I'm a fan.
Because, we all need to be a little bit more informed on this subject. So,
and God, my thing is, like, why wouldn't you want to be? Like, I think the political reasons are the most important, in that it like has directly to do with the well-being of people, and that's always got to be at the top of the priority list. Yeah. But also, like, how the hell boring is your life if you're not trying to understand where other people come from?
Yeah, that's right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, like, or even to just actually be informed on a subject that you want to have an opinion on.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Like, if nothing else, just be informed on what you're saying.
Absolutely.
Okay, so where can people find your content?
Best thing to do is you can go to queersplaining.com. That's the podcast, the website where my podcast lives. But I also don't really know anyone that actually goes to podcast websites. Like, almost everyone has their podcast app of choice, and you should be able to find Queersplaining in it.
Yeah, that's right.
And then other than that, I'm at Callie Gets It on Twitter. I do lots of Star Trek shit posting, lots of yelling about queer and trans stuff, and occasionally speaking in Klingon.
So is there anything you'd like to mention before we go?
No, I think we covered it. I talk a lot. Sorry.
No, that's deadly. All right. Well, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. So that's it for the interview. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to get that last 5 minutes of the discussion with Callie, then you can go to patreon.com/skepticalleftist and become a patron, or email me, mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com, and I will send you the audio file or a link to the unlisted video so that you can go and watch that extra 5 minutes. And now I take you over to the book review with Justin Clark.
Hi, and welcome to Read Reviews, episode number 4.
Yeah.
So I just finished processing the work we did with Michael Parenti's book, Inventing Reality. It was really, it's a really good review. I think people should watch it. Obviously. So I'm looking forward to this week's. I think we're going to talk about something that's relevant to current events.
Yes. So as I think many of your listeners probably know, over the last few weeks, we have seen the continued bombardments against the Palestinian people by the State of Israel. And recently, as I think even today, President Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, met with President Benjamin Netanyahu about policies going forward and so on and so forth. And so I thought, because this is so fresh on people's minds, the sort of the movement for Palestine and the sort of egregious crimes of Israel over the last, few weeks, to sort of read a book that would be relevant to the discussion, that provides, I think, much needed, not only historical context, but also, I think, some theoretical understanding as well. And with that in mind, we're going to be talking tonight about Edward Said's The Question of Palestine, which is a classic work. This was published, I think, in the late 1970s, 1979. This edition was published in 1992 with a couple extra selections of writing where he kind of updates and talks about, sort of the developments post 1979. So while the book is slightly dated, there's actually quite a bit in it that reads like you could have ripped it out of the pages of the book, put it into the context of what we're talking about today, and it would fit. Okay. Largely because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as the media often likes to talk about it, when in reality what it is it's a conflict in and of itself, only in as much as the media wants to paint it as one, because it isn't really so much a conflict so much as it is a settler colonialism issue, which we'll get into. But to give you some background, so Edward Said was the professor of comparative literature at Columbia, and he also taught at Harvard, Johns Hopkins. He is best known probably for his incredibly path-breaking work, Orientalism, which came out a few years after this book. I recently listened to an interview of his where he talked about how this book, the question of Palestine, is sort of a part of an informal trilogy of books that he wrote on these questions: Orientalism, The Question of Palestine, and a book he wrote called Covering Islam, which is interesting because that book is very much kind of like the last book we talked about, where it's a critique of the media in relationship to covering Islam and particularly covering the Muslim world, which in and of itself is sort of a broad generalization. So Said was born in Palestine in the 1930s, and he died in 2003 after a long bout with cancer. Those of you who've probably heard his name, who are maybe in the atheist humanist circles, probably know about the very public break that the late author Christopher Hitchens had with Edward Said over the question of Islamism or Islamofascism, as Hitchens called it. Hitchens was a early sort of celebrator of Said's work, and then post 9/11 they have this very public break, which goes in line with a lot of what happens with Hitchens.
Yeah, that's right.
As his political shift, right? So what he does in this book is he does a couple of things. One of them is that he provides historical context for understanding where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict comes from, and ultimately what it has meant for Palestinians. So he talks about how there have been numerous books about Israel from the Israeli perspective, keeping their concerns in mind. But at the time, there weren't as many books written in the English language that explicitly dealt with the issue of Palestine and from the standpoint of Palestinians. So I think this is an incredibly brilliant work. It's the first book of his I'd ever read. He has a a long list of books that are incredibly influential in the field of post-colonial studies. Obviously, I mentioned Orientalism. The other book that's really important is a book called Culture and Imperialism. And he's done public lectures and stuff you can probably watch on YouTube.
Definitely have to check some of those out.
Yeah, for sure. And so being born in Palestine, he came to the United States as one of many people who became a part of the sort of Palestinian diaspora, which at the publishing of this book was around 4 million people. Today, it's actually closer to around 6 million people.
Okay.
And he talks about how Palestinians around the world are sort of divided into different groups. So you have those who always lived within Israel proper. Then there were those who lived in the sort of Palestinian territories. Okay. And then there were those who left. Some by choice, mostly not by choice. And those people ended up going into countries like Jordan, Syria, the United States, the UK, other parts of Europe. And so, interestingly enough, much like the Jewish diaspora, which still exists to this day, I think the global population of Jewish people is like 20 million or something like that. And again, they're scattered all over the world with sort of a hub in Israel. Palestine is the same. The Palestinians are sort of the same way, although that they're less. So that's an important understanding to think about, is that the Palestinians at this point are essentially a people without a state. So they don't have an actual like state for them to live in, to have legal protections under, to have rights from. Often what you'll hear in referring to Gaza is people call it the world's largest open-air prison because it's essentially an occupied territory that has been occupied since 1948 when Israel was created. So before I get more into more detail, I think it's important to provide listeners with some additional context. So where did this come from? Why is there Palestine? Why is there Israel? Why is all this going on? Well, with much of modern history, the development of the state of Israel can in many ways be tied to World War I. So, and I think we talked about this last time. Now the concept of Zionism itself goes back to the mid-19th century, if not earlier. But as a specific, explicit political project, it's about mid-19th century and particularly picks up steam with the 1880s and 90s. But World War I is the moment. So before World War I, the land that was known as Palestine, which is known today as Israel, and parts of it that are the occupied territories that make up what people think of as Palestine, were part of what was called the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire collapsed during World War I, largely as a result of the British Empire guaranteeing certain countries independence in exchange for fighting on their side. Turkey is probably the most notable example of this.
Okay, yeah.
Where you have Kemal Ataturk and so forth. They were called the Young Turks, which is, most people think of Cenk Uygur now, but that's where that comes from. And so when Palestine became a sort of independent region of its own, and I say independent with really big scare quotes because it's not really independent, but separate from the Ottoman Empire, it becomes essentially a colony of the British Empire. And it's governed by the British from around 1920 till 1948. So the most, I think, striking chapter of the book, and the one that's probably the most controversial in this discussion, is the chapter called Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. Mm-hmm. So the history of Zionism as a political project is tied to one of its founders, a guy named Theodor Herzl. There were other very influential Zionist political philosophers and leaders like Chaim Weizmann, Joseph Weitz, Theodor Herzl I mentioned earlier. So there was a slew of these guys. And I think it's important, and this is what I really want to stress, because this is something I wanted to stress the last time. One of the things that I think is a problem in our political discourse is there's often a sort of conflating of Zionism with Judaism.
Right, yeah.
And those are not the same thing. But the problem is that the way that mainstream discourse handles both of them is it kind of treats them as interchangeable. And that's not true. So the way that I think about it is this. And what I'm going to address tonight is this specific thing, which Saeed in the book addresses as well.
Okay.
Because it's very important that we critique this stuff from specific historical and material conditions. It's important because if we don't, then it does actually fall into the territory of anti-Semitism, which I think is important that we bring up in this conversation and say, like, look, like, it's important to avoid genuine anti-Semitism. So
yeah, anti-Semitism is bad.
Yes, it is bad. As people have called it before, I think Philosophy Tube, she did an incredible video about this a while back where she referred to it as being the socialism of fools, which I think she gets from somewhere else. But
yeah,
it's exactly
I've heard
right.
that before as well.
Anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, right? So what is Zionism? It's a really great question. And it's the one that he tries to address in the book. So Zionism was a political project that really started in the mid-19th century and really started to pick up steam by World War I. And what it was that the Jewish people who had been largely scattered around the globe and had felt the consequences of being scattered around the globe.
Right.
And again,
people without a state, right?
Yes, they were, and the way they referred to it as a people without a land without a people. That was the phrase that was used to that was the slogan of Zionism, right? Now, the people without a land part, that was absolutely right. The Jewish diaspora did not have a land. But the idea that there was a land without a people was not true. And people often wonder, why is the United States so connected to Israel? Why is that the case? And the argument that I think Saeed makes in the book, and one that I agree with, is that it doesn't have anything to do with sort of the cheap, disgusting kind of anti-Semitic tropes where it's like, well, AIPAC rules the world, and you'll hear all this kind of bullshit.
Of course not. Yeah.
What it really is at its heart, Zionism is, according to Saeed, and I agree, is a European settler colonial project.
Yeah.
And it uses the sort of ideological architecture of European-style colonialism as its justification for sort of moving into the land of Palestine. So pre-1948, there were not as many Jewish people in Palestine, as we understand it as Palestine, as there were Arabs. And it's also important to note that there were also subcultures within the land of Palestine, which would later become Israel, that were not Arab, nor were they Jewish. So you had a Christian community, you had a unique sect to the region called the Druze, Druze, and then there was like one other one I can't remember. Okay. So you have all these different cultures all in one small place. Keep in mind, Israel's not very large, and and it's right next to Egypt. Jordan is right above it, and Syria is right next to it. So it's in this very small pocket. And Zionism's whole project was that thousands of years ago, the Jewish people laid claim to Israel, and that was their chosen land.
Right.
And what Zionism's project is to return to the homeland of the Jews, right? So it's important to note that Judaism is a religion and Zionism is a political project that uses religion. And I think those are the two things that I think it's important to understand how they're different.
Right.
I can stop there. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just thinking where does I've heard it said, obviously I'm still connected to the atheist community in various ways. And it's often discussed about Republicans in the United States being so pro-Israel because of their belief in theocracy in America. They really want to push forward like their Christian theocracy. Yes,
I agree. And I think that's a huge part of it. And also a part of it that's super important is the way that they interpret scripture. So a YouTuber I really, really love, she's incredible, Rebecca Watson, just did a video about this, where she talked about there's the ancient prophecy of Gog, or Magog, the city of Magog. And so there are a lot of right-wing evangelical Christian theocrats in the United States that support the Israeli state in the Zionist project largely out of self-interest. So they'll talk a lot about like, oh, we care about the plight of the Jewish people. They don't really care about that. That's like that's the ideological architecture they put on top what they really want, which is that they believe by the return of a Jewish state and the establishment of a Jewish state that the Christ will come back and begin the sort of the rapture and the redeeming of the human race. Like that's what they genuinely believe. So that's a huge part of it, right? And I think that people who think of themselves as largely secular would nevertheless, who are part of the sort of right-wing project of Zionism, which I see Zionism as a right-wing project. I know that people think of it as being sort of there are liberal Zionists, people who like write for The Atlantic or Peter Beinart or whatever. But if you really want to understand like the nature of the situation, like liberal Zionism does exist, but that doesn't necessarily make it left-wing.
No, I would argue that liberalism is also right-wing, or at least centrist, right?
Yes. So there isn't like a left-wing Zionism, right? That just doesn't really exist. So you're right in the sense that so the component you just talked about is super important, right? This sort of cultural, religious, ideological connection between sort of Zionism as a project and the United States and sort of right-wing theocracy as a project. But what I think ultimately ties them more together, and I think what Saeed argues in the book and I do, is that both of them are built on sort of European-style settler colonialism, which, in my opinion, and Saeed writes this in the book, and I know this is controversial, but it essentially is based on white supremacy.
Yeah.
So the argument, I mean, and this really goes to the heart of a lot of the issue. So if you look at, let me see if I can find a quote here from one of the writers. I mean, I think it's really instructive because this stuff that I'm going to try to find here in the book, this passage from this journalist, it literally reads like something that Sam Harris could have written. It's incredible. So, so I'm going to read this to you now. So before I read this section, I'm going to preface this by saying that like there are a lot of people who are Zionists, who believe in the project of Israel, who are not racist. I want to stress that incredibly, okay? They're not racists, you know? But the project itself, one of its unintended consequences is racism, because the way that it's set up is that Israel, from the very beginning, has always tried to set itself up as being connected to Europe. Mm-hmm. And it sees itself as an extension of Europe. It doesn't see itself really as a part of the Middle East, even though it is. It sees itself more in kinship with Europe. And there's a reason for that, which is that the justification for it is the same justification that the founders of the United States used to not only wipe out the Native American population in the United States, but also to subjugate African Americans in slavery, which is this idea of greater or lesser races. Scientific racism in and of itself is a huge component to settler colonialism in general and the Zionist project in particular. It's something you can't get away from. And with that in mind, I'm going to read you this passage. This is from a gentleman named Dr. A. Karlbach, who was a distinguished citizen of Israel and described by Saeed as not a crude demagogue. He wrote this article in the publication Mariv on October 7th, 1955. So we're almost 10 years out from the creation of Israel, which was in 1948.
Okay. So
this passage is fascinating. I may not read all of it because it's kind of long, but I'm going to read part of it. These Arab Islamic countries do not suffer from poverty or disease or illiteracy or exploitation. They only suffer from the worst of all plagues, Islam. Wherever Islamic psychology rules, there is the inevitable rule of despotism and criminal aggression. The danger lies in Islamic psychology, which cannot integrate itself into the world of efficiency and progress, that lives in a world of illusion perturbed by attacks of inferiority complexes and megalomania, lost in dreams of the holy sword. And it kind of goes on like that.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about the whole idea, and this goes and to like sum this up perfectly, some of your listeners may know this, but there's this stupid, disgusting, racist tweet that Ben Shapiro did a few years ago,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Where he said, essentially along the lines of like, Israelis live in civilization and Arabs like to live in open sewage.
Yeah, yeah.
And this goes back into that whole paradigm, which is that settler colonialism is based on progress, right? So scientific advancement, scientific progress, which Israel has been a part of. There's no doubt that there's been some material scientific progress as a part of the Zionist project. There's no doubt. But it's also tied to this idea that the Arabs are ungovernable, that they are savage, that they are governed by their passions, not their intellect, that they are incensed by tribal notions, all this kind of shit.
Right. Like, that's literally the rhetoric you hear about from racists all over the place, all over through time.
Right. And it's the same kind of argument, just, take out Arabs and put in, blacks or put in Asians. Like, it's the same shit. Right.
Yeah.
Which is that we are a part of a higher stage of civilization. And therefore, because we're a part of a higher stage of civilization, that gives us the moral license to do what we do.
Right, right.
And that is, I think, the problem of Zionism as a political project, is that from the get-go, it acknowledged that in order for it to succeed, someone had to fail, because it was never predicated on the idea that we would create a mutual agreement between Palestine and us, and that we would create a dual state or some kind of unified secular state where everyone lived together. That was never the project, because ultimately the Zionist project is an ethno-state project. It's the idea of a Jewish state for the Jews. And for decades, they basically denied the Palestinians that they even really existed. And so you would often have where they wouldn't even talk about them, or they wouldn't even speak about them. So, from the standpoint of Zionism's victims, as Saeed calls it, is really the complete degradation of not just the political identity with which you affiliate with and the state identity that you were part of your whole life, but it's also a real destruction of your sense of dignity, of your sense of autonomy, and your sense of justice. Those all go out the window. And so, again, it's important to understand that, like, there's a logic to why Israel is the way it is, because it's built into the ideology that created it. And so it's basically seeing some people as less than human. And in doing that, it creates a project that ultimately justifies itself. And so when you hear dumbasses say things like, well, this is, and you've even heard politicians, I mean, even Obama, I think, has even said this, where they say, well, this is a conflict that's gone back thousands of years. Actually, that's not true. That's not even remotely true. That's total horseshit. First off, Islam has only been around for about 1,400 years.
Right.
So it can't be thousands of years, right? Judaism itself goes back, 4,000 to 6,000 years. Roughly. But the conflict itself is not thousands of years old. It can't be.
Yeah, no.
And you'll often hear this, I think even in atheist circles. This was an argument I believed in when I was more ignorant, was that, like, oh, if they could just get over their religion, then they could get along. But that's not the issue. The issue is one of national independence, where the British Empire essentially promised both sides of this conflict that we will provide you with national independence.
Right.
And then they renege on both of them. No surprise, right? So in World War I, it was called the Balfour Declaration, which we discussed before. And I think in the last episode, we talked about Lord Balfour's declaration, which was to create a state of Israel in then known as Palestine. And that was after World War I, or during World War I. Obviously, that didn't happen. And then the Holocaust happened, right? And so there's a lot of, like, understandable, like, the Jewish people should have their own home. There's a logic to that. There's a moral weight to that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make enough sense to build that, which is a moral project in and of itself, on land that is already occupied by people, and not including them in that process.
Yeah.
So when Israel was created between 1944 and 1948, Israel was declared a state in 1948. you'll often hear politicians talk about how the United States of America was the first country to recognize the state of Israel. It did it 11 minutes after they declared it. So ultimately, if you look at, anyway, sorry, where I was going with this is, so with all of this in mind, what is the Palestinian identity, right? And so the Palestinian identity is one, and this is one of the other big chapters in the book, is what does it mean to be a Palestinian? Mm-hmm. And eventually, when we talked about earlier about the slogan of Zionism being, people without a land without a people. Palestinians are a people without a state.
Yeah.
And so they don't have the kind of political representation or political freedom that we would, or that even Israel has, right?
Right.
And so, today, and the thing is, there are many maps you can look at, pre-1948 Israel, the creation of Israel as a state, and then you have the pockets of within Israel itself that were Palestinian territories. So you have the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and then you have East, I think it was Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Less so the Golan Heights today. Right. And part of that is because of settlements. So Israel over the last 70 years has continually pushed up against Palestinian territory and claimed it as its own. Right. And, after saying we will not do this, they proceed to do this, which is very similar to what the United States did with Native Americans, where we would make treaties with Native Americans where, you can stay in this land, and then eventually we would just either force them out or kill them. Yeah. And somebody posted a graphic that I think is instructive about how close the project of Israel is to the project of the United States. And it's like the land that the Native Americans get to have and the land the Palestinians have, and it just dwindles over time into just little pockets that they get to keep. And so they don't, you can't drive a car anywhere. You can't just leave anywhere. You can't, people in Gaza, I think, only have like 4 hours of electricity a day. Like they live in absolutely inhumane conditions.
Yeah.
And so, and then for those who left, the identity of feeling like an outsider, that you kind of don't belong anywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And you would think that the people who founded Israel, who lived the very same thing as a part of the Jewish diaspora, would have some kind of sympathy for that. And I would imagine that many rank and file people do, but the leadership doesn't. Yeah. But the leadership just doesn't.
It often, it makes me think of you can probably talk to a random citizen of Israel and they would be, sympathetic, and they would say, yes, we need to do something to fix this situation. But as far as the people in power, the state itself, states don't like to give up power once they have it. Yes. So they won't give up resources, land, power, anything once they have them. So.
Mm-hmm. And again, you're right. And the thing is that and I want to tread lightly here, because I think it's important that there are some scholars, particularly Norm Finkelstein, who's written a book called The Holocaust Industry, where he talks about the way in which, and again, his words, not mine. You can get shitty with him. Don't get shitty with me. I'm just a messenger. But that essentially, in some respects, that, some of the more cynical and I think, morally questionable, to say the least, people who support the Zionist project kind of use the Holocaust in a cynical way to sort of justify their own abuses against the Palestinians. And again, I'm not saying this is the majority of the people. I'm not saying that's what they do, but that's,
I just was wondering, okay, when was the book written again?
So this book, The Question of Palestine, was written in 1979, and then he wrote a lengthy introduction and epilogue that were written in the early 90s. So again, so this book is written, I think, 10 years before the creation of Hamas. So Hamas doesn't come up in the book at all. Right? Yeah,
that's kind of what I was wondering. I know that Hamas's even existence and their role in Gaza is a tool that many people use to justify crimes by Israel.
Yes. And I want to make sure that we not excuse or the crimes of Hamas against people, but it is proportionality, right? So when Hamas fires off rockets, 1, 2, 3 people might die. Most of them are going to be IDF soldiers, right? When Israel shoots off in rockets in Gaza, they kill kids. I mean, they kill children, they kill women, they kill young people. They kill indiscriminately, and it's often hundreds, if not thousands, of people, right? Over 700,000 Palestinians were essentially evicted from Palestine between 1944 and 1948. And, so like we've seen time and time again, and a lot of times also that, Palestinian refugees ended up in Lebanon, and this, a lot of them ended up in Lebanon in the 1970s and into 1980s. And when, Israel started to bomb, and started their war with Lebanon in the early 1980s, this led to refugee camps and refugee sites of Palestinians being bombed and killed. And there's indiscriminate violence that exists. And so again, it's because I think it's important not to say that like because it's, I don't know, like it's kind of the argument of like, well, if she hadn't worn that short skirt, she wouldn't have been, assaulted. I don't want to say that.
Victim blaming, right.
Yeah, I don't want to do victim blaming here, but it's important to understand that like Palestine does not have an actual military. Like it just doesn't. Right. And so, Israel has a massive, well-trained, well-funded, largely by the United States, military that is extremely successul at its job, which is to obliterate people and to obliterate buildings. I mean, they do things by design, right? Like, so recently, one of the big news stories was them destroying the Gaza journalism building that had the Associated Press. It had Al Jazeera in it. And the justification that they used was, well, it was suspected that Hamas had leaders in there. And this was parroted by the Western press. And it turns out weeks later that no, that was a complete lie. Like they just made that up to justify it. Right. So Hamas is kind of like the catch-all explanation that sort of covers up the crimes of Israel. And it just shouldn't, and again, that's not to discount the actual crimes of Hamas. It just doesn't. But,
two things can be true at the same time.
Fucking A. Like, that's exactly right. So, and in many ways, Hamas was a logical result of the sort of the failures of the organization that Saeed spends a incredible amount of time on in the book and lauds quite a bit, which is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization.
Okay.
The PLO, which was led at this time by Yasser Arafat, whom some people might know. He was very, very influential within Palestinian politics. He was a part of the Camp David Accords in 2000. He was a part of the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. And, a lot of the sort of more radical end of Palestinian politics saw him as sort of a capitulator. And so, Hamas, in my opinion, was a logical result of some of the failures of the more moderate voices within the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, like that sounds. I try to, on some level, like draw parallels, right? Like if we're drawing a parallel with North American settler colonialism, and we think like, okay, what would we say if indigenous peoples had started bombing things and started acting in like AIM, like, not that they bombed a lot of shit, but like,
yeah, exactly. Or the Black Panthers is another example.
Yeah, that's right. Like, from my perspective, these backlashes, they often seem very like justified, even if we don't necessarily like everything that they do.
Totally.
Right?
Yes. Because I think of it this way, it's like if you back a dog into a corner and you keep kicking it or you keep poking it with a stick, at some point it's just going to rip you. It's going to just rip out and revolt against you. That's the same situation, right? The Palestinian people don't have that much of a recourse against whatever Israel wants to do.
Right.
So, because again, they don't get to the tune of $3 to $5 billion a year for the United States, to kind of catch us up to today, because unfortunately we lost Edward Said almost 20 years ago now, and this book is a little bit more dated. I mean, the future for Palestinian struggle is the future of the struggle of the broader left. If you consider yourself a leftist, whatever stripe, you should find a kinship with the struggle for Palestine.
Yeah.
And there is some criticism within the left. I would call it the trad left, of people who say, hey, why do we almost always so weirdly focus on Israel? This is a criticism you'll often hear a lot about, like, why does the left always obsess over about Israel? Well, the main reason that I think it's important to talk about it is because the single largest foreign supporter of Israel is the United States. And I'm an American citizen, right? You know, my government is doing this stuff in my name. It's doing it in the name of our citizenry. So, and has been doing it for years. I mean, there's a statistic in here that between, you know, a period of 30 years from the 40s through the 70s or the 80s, you know, the United States gave $77 billion worth of aid to Israel, right?
Right.
So, you know, that's why I care. I mean, you know, and people, why do people always weirdly focus on it? And it's like, well, because it is the foremost struggle, right? And it is akin to South Africa, which is part of the reason why the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, is one of the most moral movements of our time. It's the thing that should, you know, this is exactly what was done with South Africa, and that's going to be the success going forward. And you're seeing a lot of bills across the country, especially in red states, trying to make BDS illegal, which is a violation of the First Amendment. It's a flat out violation of political rights. And these people talk all the time about how much they care about free speech, but then it's like, well, no, it's for free speech you like. It's for freedom of you to say bigoted and racist shit, you know, on Joe Rogan's podcast. Like, that's the free speech you want.
Yeah, that's right.
So my thinking on the subject is that political leaders with high within the government, I mean, particularly people within the Democratic Party, it's not enough. It's just not enough. I mean, the fact is that we have sitting members of Congress who say that Israel is an apartheid state is huge. Like, because it is. It objectively is. And I remember when I was in high school, when Jimmy Carter released his book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, where he talked about this very thing. And there was a whole documentary about that whole era when that book came out. I think it was like 2007, you know, and Alan Dershowitz and all of the ADL and all of the usual suspects came out of the woodwork to call Jimmy Carter an anti-Semite because he had said this stuff. When he was saying very basic truths, you know, that were essentially like obvious to anyone involved. And because this book was written in the late 70s, this book took place after the first Camp David Accords in 78, 79, which were brokered between Egypt and Israel, which Jimmy Carter was a part of. It's one of his singular accomplishments as president. And so Jimmy Carter has a very lukewarm reception by Saeed in the book. He doesn't hate him, but he doesn't love him either. He's just, you know, I mean, I would say in the history of American empire, like, Jimmy Carter is certainly one of its softer faces. But
not perfect by any stretch.
Not perfect, but he's still the face of the empire, right? But the fact that a former president would flat out say this is an apartheid state was like huge, and he got raked over the coals for that shit. But now that we actually have sitting members of Congress saying the same thing is great. What I would argue for those like Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, AOC, I would love for Bernie Sanders to do this, is to flat out say we support BDS. That, you know, you should support BDS. And I know that, like, as a sitting member of Congress, that's a bold move to make. But I think that really separates the sort of the wheat from the chaff. To me, that's the moral movement going forward. It's not enough to just say these things are bad. You actually have to explicitly support the most broad-based, non-violent movement that's dedicated to peace and justice in Palestine. So, like, you either support it or you don't. And if you don't, then get the fuck out of the way because you're not serious. And had Saeed lived, he would have certainly have supported BDS.
Well, I just feel like I've seen some, I don't know, pretty harsh criticism coming from people that it seems like it's so disingenuous. Like, this idea that we're going to boycott things coming out of Israel. Like, how is that, you know, anti-Semitic terrorism or, you know, like I'm sorry, it's just not. Like, we're just not buying things from a state that is harming innocent people.
Exactly, right. And it's important you bring up the word terrorism, right? Because that plays a key part of the book where he talks about how huge segments of the population are often just referred to as terrorists. There's no discussion. There's no debate. There's no obvious evaluation of the facts of the case. They're just described as terrorists because that's the way of just to, get it off the hook and you can do whatever you want. And we saw what happens when you do that kind of shit. And that was the Bush era, right? Where you had waterboarding and extraordinary rendition and political prisoners who, in Guantanamo Bay and all of the, the mass surveillance of Americans. We know what happens when you use that sort of logic and language of terrorism. So it's the same thing again, is instead of, because calling all these people just terrorists or, they're just evil, they're all like Hamas. What that does for the Zionist project is it allows itself to get off the hook. It allows it to get sort of a get out of jail free card where it doesn't actually have to reckon with the consequences of its own project. It doesn't have to deal with them. It doesn't have to deal with the fact that you share this land with the people, that you forced a lot of them out, that you stripped away any rights of those who stayed, and you're continually taking the land and the literal lives of the people who stay. Yeah. All in the name of your project. And by calling them terrorism and just calling them terrorists, then you don't have to deal with it. Right. And so so it's important, I think, for people to understand that the way that the Western media, particularly the American media, covers Israel is almost terrible. I mean, it's absolutely horrible. Yeah. And so it's important to follow good sources, people who are good on this issue. So Norm Finkelstein is one. Abby Martin of the Empire Files. She's done an incredible documentary about Gaza that I highly recommend everybody watch. Katie Halper, anybody on the left who understands this issue broadly, they get it. And because ultimately what Saeed argues for in the book is a secular, either two-state solution, which is largely dead now. It's almost impossible. Or the mainstream position, which is a one-state solution where you grant full and equal political rights to Palestinians and that you return the settlement lands to them. That's the bare minimum. And so, Saeed makes the argument that what we need to develop is a sort of, much akin to the late Michael Brooks, this idea of a cosmopolitan, humanist, secular sort of polity that is rooted in human rights, that's rooted in true values that represent everyone and not just pockets of people or a particular ethnicity or a particular religion. Yeah. And so that's really the future. That's the hope that we go for. So like I said, I think Question of Palestine, it's a great book. I highly recommend people check it out. Cool. Saeed was one of the best. And, until the very end, he was always a strong supporter of Palestine and its future. So, plus there's also a really great picture of him throwing rocks at IDF forces, which is just fun. While he was, dying of cancer, there's a picture of him in Palestine in 2000. He's throwing rocks and he's with these other guys, He practiced what he preached. He genuinely believed in the project. All
right. Where can people find your stuff?
They can find me at justinclark.org, which is my website. You can find me at Justin Clark PH on Instagram. I recently published an article on Lenin and religion with Midwestern Marx, the online publication, and I have an article coming out this month in the Truth Seeker magazine.
Oh, cool.
About Robert Ingersoll, my thesis subject, and his sort of supposed encounter with Lew Wallace, the guy who wrote Ben-Hur. I expect to be writing more for the Truth Seeker in the future. And read Edward Said. I highly recommend people go read the Question of Palestine. And then the other book I highly recommend people check out is a book called 10 Myths About Israel, which is by an Israeli historian named Ilan Pape. So.
Okay, cool. And I guess before we go, this is the first time we've been doing this on Twitch. This is the only place we're going to live stream this. Obviously, if you want to rewatch it, I will have this out in 2 weeks, approximately, when I'm done all the processing and everything.
And then I think what we'll do next time, we'll do The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, which we were going to do this week, but I wanted to do this book first to sort of But next week, we'll be talking all about MMT, or next time.
Sounds good. Sounds good. That's all, folks. Thanks for listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work, so that I don't have to work as many hours at gig jobs. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send me money on PayPal at paypal.me/brainstormpodcast. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out my link tree at linktr.ee/skepticalcorey. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, and From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, or you can send me a friend request at facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at themindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening or watching, and remember, the truth leans left.